the first week of August 1942, in a basement room beneath the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard at a facility that did not officially appear on any organizational chart of the United States Navy, a man named Joseph John Rochefort was reading mail that was not addressed to him. He had been doing this for 9 months. The mail was encoded. It had been transmitted in a cipher that the Imperial Japanese Navy had assumed was Unbreakable, a machine-generated system built on a code book of roughly 45,000 5-digit groups that the Japanese called Navy Cipher Book D, that American cryptanalysts had designated JN-25. The room Rochefort worked in was called the dungeon by the men who worked there. It had no windows. It had folding cots for the analysts who could not bring themselves to leave. It smelled of cigarettes, coffee, the particular mechanical odor of IBM tabulating machines running through punch cards at full speed around the clock. Rochefort was not a conventional naval officer. He had been born in Dayton, Ohio in 1900, commissioned as an ensign in 1918, had spent the better part of 2 decades learning languages nobody in the peacetime Navy thought he would ever need. He had studied Japanese in Tokyo for 3 years, beginning in 1929. He had spent another tour at sea practicing what he had learned against intercepted Japanese transmissions at a time when the Japanese military was not yet at war with anyone the United States cared about. By December 1941, when a Japanese carrier strike force destroyed the battle fleet that his own navy had assembled as a deterrent in the waters outside his office window, Rochefort had been reading fragments of Japanese naval traffic for longer than most of his superiors had understood there was anything worth reading. He commanded a unit called Combat Intelligence Unit, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, that was known by the acronym FRUPAC, and which at the moment of Pearl Harbor employed fewer than 24 working analysts on a rotating watch schedule that left most of them barely functional. What those analysts had inherited when they arrived at the dungeon was not a solved problem. JN-25 had first been identified as a distinct system by American cryptanalysts in 1939. By 1941, the Navy's code-breaking effort at Station Cast in the Philippines and at Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had broken enough of it to read roughly 10 to 15% of any given message. That figure sounds small. In the context of what it enabled, it was not small at all. 10% of a message about fleet movements was enough to establish that a fleet was moving. It was enough to establish a direction. It was enough to establish with careful inference from partially decoded groups a timeline. The inference part was what Rochefort was unusually good at. It was inference far more than raw decryption that would determine what happened next in the Pacific. The specific intelligence problem that Rochefort's unit was working in the summer of 1942 had to do with a place that most Americans could not have found on a map, and that the Imperial Japanese Navy had occupied without significant resistance 8 months after Pearl Harbor. Guadalcanal is a mountainous, jungle-covered island approximately 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, lying at the southeastern end of the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 1,600 miles northeast of Australia. Its strategic value in the summer of 1942 was not agricultural or commercial or historical. It was an airstrip. The Japanese had begun constructing a fighter and bomber base on the island's northern coastal plain in the late spring of 1942. By early July, the construction crews working under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's Southeast Area Command had graded a runway long enough to land twin-engine aircraft. An operational Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal would place land-based bombers within range of the Allied supply lines running between the United States and Australia. In the opinion of Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, it would also place Japanese air power within range of every Allied base in the southwestern Pacific from which any counteroffensive against Japan could reasonably be launched. King ordered a landing. The date he set was the 1st of August 1942, later pushed to the 7th when the logistical situation at the staging base in Fiji proved more complicated than his staff had estimated. The landing force assigned to the operation was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift, a Charlottesville, Virginia, native who had been in the Marine Corps since 1909 and who received his orders for the Guadalcanal operation with 6 weeks of preparation time and an incomplete set of maps. The amphibious task force that would carry his division to the island was commanded by Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. The covering naval force, the warships that would screen the transports against Japanese surface and air attack during the landing, was commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had already commanded American carrier task forces at Coral Sea and at Midway, and who in both engagements had lost ships he did not feel he could afford to lose again. The problem that Rochefort's intelligence addressed, the problem that no amount of planning could resolve without it, was what the Japanese fleet was going to do about a Marine division landing on an island that the Imperial Navy considered part of its defensive perimeter. Mikawa had surface warships at Rabaul, the major Japanese base at the northeastern tip of New Britain, approximately 650 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. He had cruisers and destroyers. He had the option of running them south through the passage between the New Georgia Sound and the open Pacific, down what would come to be called the Slot, striking the Allied transport fleet while it was still unloading. Whether he would do this, when he would do this, with what force he would do it were questions that could not be answered. Led by aerial reconnaissance alone, this was because the aircraft available to monitor Rabaul Harbor were few. Their range was extreme. Their crews were not always certain what they were photographing when they got back, what FRUPAC could do. What it did in the days immediately before the landing was read Japanese administrative traffic that the Imperial Navy was transmitting in lesser protected ciphers alongside the main JN-25 stream. These were logistics messages, supply requests, movement orders for auxiliary vessels, the kind of bureaucratic correspondence that any large military organization generates continuously, and that no operational security protocol ever entirely suppresses. Rochefort's analysts had broken enough of this secondary traffic to track the organizational composition of the 8th Fleet. That was Mikawa's command, with a degree of accuracy that Turner's Surface Force intelligence officers found difficult to credit when FRUPAC's estimates were transmitted to them. The estimates were more accurate than the officers receiving them believed estimates could be. That meant they were not treated with the urgency that their accuracy deserved. On the night of the 8th and 9th of August 1942, the second night after the Marine landing, Mikawa led a column of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer south through the Slot at 26 knots with all lights extinguished. He had departed Rabaul on the morning of the 7th. American submarines had sighted his column twice during the day on the 8th. The sighting reports had been transmitted to Turner and to Fletcher. The reports were received. They were not acted on with enough speed to deploy the Allied cruiser screen protecting the transport anchorage at Savo Island before Mikawa arrived. At 1:36 in the morning of the 9th, his column opened fire on a group of Allied heavy cruisers that had not formed for combat and whose radar operators had not yet identified the Japanese ships approaching at close range in the darkness. In approximately 32 minutes, Mikawa's force sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers: the USS Astoria, the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes. The HMAS Canberra went to the bottom of a stretch of water that would eventually be called Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of warships that came to rest in it before the campaign concluded. 1,077 Allied sailors died. Mikawa then withdrew without attacking the transports, a decision that his own superiors later judged to be the most consequential error of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The reason Mikawa's withdrawal mattered as much as it did was what it left intact. The transports were still there, the Marines were still going ashore, and the supplies, imperfectly unloaded as they were when Fletcher pulled his carriers back to the south the following morning, and Turner felt compelled to withdraw his transports before they finished unloading, had established enough of a presence on the island that Vandegrift's division retained the partially completed Japanese airstrip that his men had seized on the first day of the landing. The Marines called it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had died at Midway. The possession of that airstrip, one graded runway approximately 2, 600 feet long on a hot and malarial coastal plain surrounded by jungle that the Japanese garrison had not yet given up, was the entire operational logic of the campaign that followed. FRUPAC's contribution to the campaign did not end with the pre-landing intelligence. Throughout August and September 1942, as the Japanese began feeding reinforcement troops onto the island in small increments using fast destroyer transports running down the slot at night in a resupply operation the Marines called the Tokyo Express, Rochefort's unit and its sister organizations tracked the composition and timing of those runs with enough reliability to give Henderson Field's small and undersupplied air garrison adequate warning. The warning was not always in time, and the interceptions were not always successful. But the intelligence picture that American codebreakers maintained across the Guadalcanal campaign produced an asymmetry and situational awareness that the Japanese, who never achieved a comparable penetration of American naval communications, could not match. By October 1942, the Japanese were feeding division-strength reinforcements onto the island in preparation for a major ground offensive intended to retake Henderson Field in a single-night assault. American codebreakers read enough of the associated naval traffic to establish that the offensive was coming, that it was time to coincide with a major fleet engagement intended to neutralize American naval strength in the area, that it was larger than anything the Japanese had attempted since the landing. The ground offensive against Henderson Field on the night of the 24th and 25th of October failed. Lieutenant General Haruyoshi Hyakutake's 17th Army had assembled approximately 20,000 troops on the island by that point, against Vandegrift's roughly 23,000 Marines and Army soldiers holding a perimeter of approximately 12 miles. The Japanese assault plan required multiple regimental columns to attack simultaneously from the south and east, breach the Marine perimeter in darkness, reach the airfield before American firepower could organize a coherent defense. The timing of the assault was signaled to the waiting fleet offshore by the capture of Henderson Field itself. The fleet offshore, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo with battleships and cruisers, was to sweep into the Sound once the airfield fell and shell it into permanent uselessness before American naval reinforcements could arrive. The airfield did not fall. The assault columns lost coordination in the jungle south of the perimeter and attacked piecemeal across 2 nights, losing more than 2,200 men to Marine rifle fire and artillery before Hyakutake ordered withdrawal. The fleet received no signal. It withdrew north without engaging. The intelligence basis on which American naval commanders anticipated the Japanese fleet's intentions during the October crisis had been built, piece by piece, over the preceding 4 months from FRUPAC's work against Japanese fleet communications. It was not solely FRUPAC. Station Negat in Washington and the British code-breaking unit operating out of Melbourne contributed their own penetrations of the same and related cipher systems. The combined picture that emerged from their collective work gave Admiral William Halsey, who had replaced Vice Admiral Robert Gormley as commander of the South Pacific area on the 18th of October, something that neither side in the Pacific War had ever previously possessed with consistent reliability. An approximate order of battle for the opposing fleet, updated in near real time, with enough detail about individual ship movements to allow disposition of American surface forces to cover the most probable Japanese axes of approach. Halsey used it. The naval battle of Santa Cruz on the 26th of October cost the Americans the carrier Hornet and cost the Japanese losses in irreplaceable carrier air crews that would limit their ability to mount offensive carrier operations for the rest of the war. The cumulative effect of what codebreakers provided at Guadalcanal has to be understood against the larger strategic context of what the campaign was deciding. In the summer and fall of 1942, the United States was simultaneously fighting in North Africa, preparing for the invasion of Northwest Africa that would become Operation Torch in November, building the industrial base that would eventually produce the numbers Albert Speer read in despair, arguing internally about whether the Pacific or the European theater represented the primary commitment. The question of whether Guadalcanal could be held with the resources then available was genuinely open through September. If the Japanese had succeeded in retaking Henderson Field, the supply line to Australia would have been threatened and exact. lie the way Admiral King had feared. The Marines who held the perimeter held it with a 1-month reserve of food and intermittent air support from an airstrip that Japanese artillery shelled on a schedule that the men on the ground came to know the way they knew the tides. What intelligence did was narrow the margins. Every warning about a Tokyo Express run that allowed Henderson's air group to intercept the destroyers before they unloaded meant fewer Japanese soldiers on the island when the ground offensive came. Every decoded fleet movement order that gave Halsey enough lead time to position his surface forces meant one less Japanese battleship shelling Henderson into rubble on a given night. The margin was always thin. On the night of the 14th and 15th of October, 2 Japanese battleships, the Congo and the Haruna, did reach Iron Bottom Sound and expended 918 14-inch shells on Henderson Field, destroying 41 of the 90 aircraft then based there and cratering the runway to the point of temporary uselessness. American codebreakers had identified the mission in advance. Halsey did not have surface forces capable of intercepting battleships in darkness with acceptable risk that night. Intelligence tells you what is coming. It does not always give you the means to stop it. The campaign ended in a Japanese evacuation on the nights of the 1st, 4th, 7th of February 1943, when destroyer squadrons lifted approximately 10,652 surviving Japanese troops off the island's northwestern beaches in an operation so well executed that American commanders initially interpreted it as a reinforcement run and only realized the evacuation had occurred after it was complete. The codebreakers had provided warning that unusual destroyer activity was being planned. The warning had been ambiguous enough about the mission's nature that it did not change the tactical response. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors committed to the Guadalcanal ground campaign, roughly 800 had died in combat or of wounds, and an additional 9,000 had died of disease before the survivors were taken off. American ground forces suffered approximately 7,100 dead from all causes across the 6-month campaign. Henderson Field, the graded runway on a malarial coastal plain that had not yet been finished when the Marines seized it, remained operational throughout. Rochefort himself did not see the end of the Guadalcanal campaign from FRUPAC. In October 1942, a dispute with naval intelligence bureaucrats in Washington over analytical credit for the Midway code-breaking work resulted in his removal from command of Combat Intelligence Unit and his reassignment to a floating dry dock command on the West Coast. That was as clear a message as the Navy knew how to send. He was replaced at FRUPAC by Commander William Goggins, and the unit continued its work without him. The intercepts continued to flow. The tabulating machines in the dungeon continued running through their punch cards through the fall of 1942 and the winter of 1943, reading mail that was not addressed to them, building the picture of Japanese fleet dispositions that would shape every major naval engagement in the Pacific from that point forward.